Okay, so since I am unable to be in class for the presentation, I just wanted to make a video of me presenting my slides so that I can contribute to the project. So for my part of the project, I was given the history of interpreting pre-1970s. So for all of you guys who did any research on the history of interpreting prior to the 1970s, you probably are in agreement with me that it was extremely difficult to find information on this era of interpreting. And the reason for that is because prior to this time period, interpreting was not a thing. It just didn't exist. Deaf people had to find other means of communication to communicate with their peers, their coworkers, their family. Unless their family also knew sign language, to communicate with somebody who did not know sign language was extremely difficult. So a couple key points that I have here, pre-1970s, the history of interpreting. In the 1960s, the ASL was actually officially recognized, I should say, as a bona fide language. So before this, sign language existed, and people used it, people learned it, people understood it, but it was not seen as an official language until the 1960s. I couldn't find an exact year for that. So in actually the year 1960, William Stokey published the first linguistic study of ASL, which just furthered the belief that ASL was becoming a bona fide, full-on language. Prior to this, people believed that language kind of was only really spoken or written. So the fact that people were using their hands to communicate was incredible. In 1964, that marked the formal beginning of interpreting as a professional career. Now, before this, people were interpreting, but there was no official beginning to the career itself, actually, because in 1964 is actually when the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf was established. Although the RID was not actually incorporated for another 10 years after 1964. So up here, if you will look to the right on top of my first slide here, you will see this is just a picture of William Stokey himself. And then below that is just the emblem for the RID. And then here you'll see I have, unfortunately, interpreting is still a relatively new profession. Not a lot of information about interpreting prior to 1970 exists because it just wasn't a thing yet, as I've already stated. So, if you think about it, 1970, that was less than 40 years ago, right? Yeah. Sorry, I'm horrible at math. Or no, that was almost 50 years ago. Sorry. Right? 1970... Yeah, 47 years ago. Sorry. So 1970, that was only 47 years ago. I mean, if you think about it, 47 years relative to, the last couple hundred years, where a lot of professions that we still see today are still, they were created back then. 50 years for a profession is not a long time, so interpreting is still relatively new. If we go to the next slide, why was interpreting so important? The creation of sign language interpreters was important because in history, deaf individuals have been highly discriminated against and very highly regarded as defective human beings. People didn't view them as someone who just lost a sense, they looked at them like they were mentally handicapped. They thought that they were inept, socially inept, intellectually inept, just defective, for lack of a better word. So just some other facts here of why why interpreting was so important. In 1000 BC, Hebrew law stated that deaf people had very limited rights to own property or to become married. So if you think about that, literally the only difference between deaf people and hearing people at this time was that they couldn't hear. Yet they were telling them that they couldn't have the same rights as people who could hear, and they couldn't get married. Ridiculous. So in 355 BC, Aristotle himself stated that all who are deaf become senseless and incapable of reason. So again, just the fact that people regarded these individuals with this disability as so lowly is just, I mean, today we think of that as ridiculous. In 77 AD, Socrates claims that deaf people are incapable of language and ideas. Again, just furthering the idea that deaf people are inept. Just silly. And the last fact that I have here was that it wasn't until actually 1521 that Rudolf Agricola, a Dutch humanist, put forth the idea that speech was separate from the ability of thought, and he believed that deaf people could actually communicate through writing. So still not 100% the where we would want to be as far as rights for deaf individuals, but this was a big step in the right direction. This was really the first time that someone said, hey, these deaf people are not intellectually inept. They can communicate. Let's give them the chance. So those are my slides. Thanks for listening.